All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're excited to have another webinar this afternoon. We're going to give everyone just about one more minute to get into the room, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, we just want to welcome everybody on behalf of Fortified Data. We're excited to host a guest today. I don't want to give too much away because I'll let him introduce himself. But we do have a nice panel of experts to discuss modernizing legacy databases from two different aspects. One from the SQL Server side or the database level, and then also from the security aspect as well. So our moderator today is going to be Frank Gill. He's a senior consultant on our team. And as we're heading through this panel discussion, if you have any questions that you would like to have answered, please submit them via the chat or the question and answer, and we'll be sure to get those on the queue for today. So Frank, if you want to start off by introducing yourself, and then we'll introduce our panel of speakers, which is pretty easy because they're both Chris.
So as Andrea said, I am a senior consultant at Fortified Data. I've been working with SQL Server since 2007, and before that I had 8 years as a mainframe programmer. So been doing this for a while. Chris Shaw.
Hi, I'm Chris Shaw. I'm one of the DBAs here at Fortified Data. I'm a technical leader on the managed services team. I've been working with SQL Server for quite a few years, and I'm really excited to be here.
Chris Silvers.
Hi, everybody. Chris Silvers. I'm the founder of a small consulting company, security consulting company called CG Silvers Consulting. I've been in the security industry as a practitioner for almost 3 decades now. First kind of got exposed to SQL Server probably early 2000s, I guess, when we started mostly from a penetration testing standpoint, but also from a consulting and giving clients advice on how to secure their data.
So with that, we can jump into the questions. And as Andrea said, if you have questions as we're going through, if you can drop those in the chat or the Q&A, and she'll be monitoring that, and we'll get those across to me. So just to kick things off, Chris Shaw, when you talk about modernizing legacy databases, what are the key drivers that you see in that space or in that effort?
A lot of our clients bring this up when they are looking at wanting to explore some of the new features that are available with some of the newer versions and some of the new platforms. It's always a common issue when they're having performance problems. It's a common discussion of, hey, what can we do to modernize this, bring this up to date? And then obviously security is always a really, really big push. Some of these legacy platforms that are out there, they're not always kept up to date with security patches, and it just creates a lot of large vulnerability areas. So I think those are the 3 big ones: is the security, the performance, and then just new feature sets.
Yeah. And just in terms of new features, I think a couple of the things that I think about in that space are, there is a push to move to the cloud, and as the new versions of SQL Server release, they are more cloud friendly. You have the ability to either link your on-prem stuff to the cloud, and there are methods to migrate your existing environments to the cloud. High availability and disaster recovery is another big one. And then just leveraging the cloud for things like backups. Traditionally you have to allocate your storage for backups, and you've got to manage that storage. With SQL Server, you can now back up to the cloud, and Azure will kind of manage that cloud storage space. So Next question is, when clients are talking about modernizing their database environment, what kind of things do you think of in terms of that modernization?
It's interesting, really kind of similar to the first question, and the conversation kind of morphs, right? When we start the conversation, um, back in the day, 15, 20 years ago, when people would have performance problems, what was the answer? It was throw more memory at it, throw more processors at it. You could always try to upgrade hardware to get you through um, poor performance issues. Today, I think the first thing that I think about when clients come and say, hey, we want to look at modernizing this, I think a lot of the work starts before you start doing the actual modernization. If your databases aren't already lean, trim, performing well, if you don't have your storage being maintained right, I think you can see that it's going to be really easy to, like you were talking about, Frank, with the cloud. It's going to be really easy to blow some of your costs just out of the roof, because if you take something that's not already designed well on prem and you upgrade that to the cloud, people just get this impression that it's going to be better handled in the cloud, and that's not the case. You're just taking a problem that you have on prem and you're moving it more towards the cloud. When virtualization was a big thing, right? When that was new, when we were talking about VMware and Hyper-V and those sort of things, it was much easier to allocate that much more hardware to it. And the cloud does the same thing. When you go into Azure or AWS, it's really easy to add more resources to it, but it's also increasing the cost tremendously. And so it's really important to make sure that before you start making some of these migrations or modernizing them, that you make sure that you get ready for what the final destination is going to be when they're on-prem. And if you're doing like an on-prem to a cloud type of a migration or modernization, or that's what's included, the time to do all of your trimming, the time to get it ready is before you start that migration, not after it's already been put into the cloud.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of that cloud migration, I always like to think about it in terms of the questions that you want to ask about why you're moving to the cloud. So that's, I think, a question that has historically with clients that I've worked with has gotten missed. You know, why are you moving to the cloud? Are you moving to the cloud because it is the new shiny thing, or are you moving to the cloud because it's going to give you what you need in terms of kind of resource flexibility and cost savings? And you're talking about in terms of sort of trimming the database environment gets to that idea of figuring out what your spend is going to be in the cloud before you actually make that move, so you don't have a case of sticker shock. Um, so the other thing I just mentioned about modernizing is, if you think about it, it kind of has two phases to it. There's your software upgrade. So if you're looking to migrate to a new version of SQL Server, 2022 is the current release. The preview version of 2025 is available, and based on Microsoft's history, I would expect that to become generally available in November of this year. Um, so that is one part of it. And then the other is just looking at your hardware and looking at the opportunity to upgrade hardware, or if you're making that move to the cloud, getting yourself onto newer hardware in terms of processor, memory, storage, that kind of thing. Right. So the next question is, from a security perspective, what do you need to be concerned about when modernizing a SQL Server database environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Frank. So, and it really dovetails into kind of what you guys were talking about to begin with. So, first and foremost, keeping the database software up to date is critical. There are always new vulnerabilities being released, on a daily basis, and threat groups are out there actively trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. Two that come to mind There's a group called Stack 6451. They specifically target Microsoft SQL servers. There's another group. If you haven't heard of them, they're called the Target Company Ransomware, or that was kind of their campaign. They're also known as Fargo. They specialize in targeting SQL vulnerabilities themselves. Now, from an upgrade perspective, like Chris was talking about, you want to kind of clean up the environment before you actually migrate to maybe a new version, or especially if you're going to move your database to the cloud, right? You don't want to have legacy practices of, using like SQL authentication with the built-in SA account, right? You want to make sure that you've, at a minimum, renamed the SA account. I mean, I know it sounds kind of silly to say, well, gosh, we've known that for 20 years. But there are so many companies that have not done that, right? Maybe there's some application that's leveraging the SA account to write data. And so they have to go back and figure out how to, reconfigure that application so it doesn't do that, right? And specifically moving to the cloud, leveraging the additional features, security features of the cloud environment itself. For example, if you're implementing a SQL database in Azure, there is Azure Defender for SQL, right? So it's specifically made to protect SQL databases. If you're using Google, there's the Google Cloud SQL security controls, right? That are available to you, and it's kind of like an easy button. As Chris mentioned, having a robust backup strategy certainly helps. Monitoring database activity, making sure that you're using appropriately configured firewalls, because I was actually just doing a penetration test last week where I came across a SQL server that was exposed to the internet. I mean, there honestly, there is, I can think of no reason why you need, port 1433 literally exposed to the internet. I mean, are you really like administering it from somewhere else? Hopefully you're logging into the VPN and then administering your SQL database, but yeah. So things like that.
Cool. And then Chris, in terms of kind of specific SQL Server functionality, what do you think about, best practices or aspects that you need to be concerned about within a modernizing effort for SQL Server?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to, what are you using the database for? In most, 99% of cases, the database is being used to drive an application, right? And the requests that are being made of the database are being made from an application, typically a web application. So, instead of using just direct queries from the application or things like that, you want to parameterize your queries and use stored procedures, and don't just use like direct queries from an application, because that brings out the SQL injection vulnerabilities that we all kind of know about and hear about in the news.
Okay. And then Chris Shaw, from kind of SQL Server security perspective, what kind of things would you recommend?
Very similar back to my initial answer. It's really the time to do a lot of cleanup when you do that modernization. Maybe you should get away from, I think, Chris had mentioned it, get away from the SA account, but get away from SQL authenticated accounts just in general. Go to try to start authenticate with Active Directory, maybe start working with some of your AD groups. Start evaluating actually what permissions are needed. I can't tell you how many times we go into a system and we start to evaluate it, and everybody has DBO access or everybody has SA access, and it's like, wow, there's a lot here.
Yeah, and just in terms of that, kind of thinking about principle of least privilege, the idea that you want to give people as little permission as possible to do what they need to do. And as Chris Shaw said, you know, you get into environments and you see that there are 30 people that have SA access. And, you know, do they need it? Probably not. You know, a database administrator probably needs it to do what they need to do. But if you have, you know, developers or application users who have SA, you have, you know, a lot of things exposed that should not be exposed. And just in terms of using, Chris Shaw mentioned AD groups, you know, it makes administration of security much easier. If you can grant the permissions to an AD group, you bring somebody else on that needs a certain set of permissions, you add them to that AD group and you're done. You don't have to worry about creating a specific login, or, you know, managing things within SQL Server. It just streamlines that process. Um, and Chris Silvers, you talked about, you know, the various bad actors that are out there to, you know, working to get into SQL Server. Is is that basically like an arms race? You know, is it a case of Microsoft and other people determining where those vulnerabilities are and closing them off? Or is it a case of sort of monitoring those bad actors, figuring out what they're doing to get in, and then um, kind of working it that way?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a combination, you know, because yes, these groups will leverage, you know, SQL vulnerabilities that are specific to that platform, but they'll also leverage bad practices. You know, like Chris Shaw said, you know, just don't use SQL authentication, use Windows authentication. And one of the main benefits of using Windows authentication is that you can actually set, you know, account lockout. Whereas, you know, if you're using SQL authentication, especially if you're using the SA account, it's you know vulnerable to brute force login guesses. And so, you know, the attackers can just sit there and just bang on that SQL Server authentication all day long until they finally, you know, and of course they automate it. It's not like there's someone, you know, cranking, you know, turning a wheel or something. It's automated stuff here. So they can let that stuff run for weeks at a time until they ultimately finally hit on a valid username and password combination, right? So very important to migrate over to Windows authentication. One of the other things is that you should be not only monitoring the database, but you should periodically have a penetration test performed on the database itself, right? Have someone come in and kind of simulate those activities of an attacker. Make sure that number one, you actually detect them doing those processes, and then number two, hopefully they're not able to actually compromise the database. The other thing to understand about databases is most SQL databases run with system access on the host system that they're running. So if an attacker is able to get access, you know, to the point where they can run things like extended stored procedures, within the database, they can actually get access to, you know, operating system commands. And since the database is running under system level access, that means they can do anything on that system they want.
That's a really good point, and that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up.
Yeah. Then I've done my job.
Yes. So next up is, how should companies, this is for Chris Shaw, start off, how should companies assess whether to upgrade, migrate, or completely replace the existing database infrastructure?
I, I think there's a lot of things that you need to consider here. This is a big area, and the very first thing I want to say is that I think we have to realize that cost is a factor. I have that is a point in my mind, but we have to to really put that near the forefront of this, there is a cost that's going to be involved. And I think understanding the cost is a big part of the decision and the risk that's involved with not doing it. I mean, that's a huge aspect too. A lot of people look at the cost and say, oh yeah, this is going to cost me, I don't know, $10, for example, to do this, but they don't realize that by not doing it, the costs are just going to get even that much more as you go down the road. Some of the technical things that I think you're going to want to do is look at the upgrade advisors. Those are going to help you understand some of the risks involved, whether or not your existing code base is going to work with some of the the target destination of where you want to go. Talk to some of the vendors that may be supplying applications that you're running on these platforms. Are the platforms still supported by the vendors? Unfortunately, software is not always increasing in their support as fast as Microsoft is, or the other vendors are putting out new versions of SQL Server. We see that quite often where we have customers that have systems that rely on platforms that aren't being upgraded as frequently as they should. Something else, though, that I think that you should also take into consideration, or something that you should assess, is what is your existing system giving you? What are you getting out of it? Are there things that you want? Is there more that you want out of the existing infrastructure? Maybe maybe your footprint's too large. Maybe you're not getting the reports that you need. If you're going to go through this process and you're going to take the put forth the effort, I think having a very clear picture of what the goal is. The goal shouldn't just be, oh, I want to get on the most recent version, or, oh, I want to be in the cloud. I think you need to have very specific achievements that you're trying to get when you get there. So by the time I get in the cloud, I want to be able to have everybody in the company to have easier access to the data without having to jump through this hoop or that hoop.
Yeah, and then another point I'd make there, just in terms of upgrading, migrating, or kind of replacing, if we're talking about moving to the cloud, with SQL Server in Azure, there are a number of managed services that are available. So I think one of the things that drives some organizations is that they may not have the resources to manage the database in-house. So by moving to a managed service in Azure, it removes the infrastructure management. The SQL Server is still there for you to manage, but in terms of, building out a server, doing a SQL Server install, and then patching that Windows or Linux, operating system, that managed service gives you the ability to kind of take that off of your plate. So that's something to consider in this point. So next question is, what are the biggest risks of delaying database modernization, and how can organizations mitigate them? And one of the things that I was thinking about with this question was, there are regulations out there that you need to comply with to do business in various places. You've got GDPR, which is regulation throughout Europe, CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, and then HIPAA, if you're dealing with any kind of personally identifiable information from a healthcare perspective. And then, Chris Silvers, I know that there are some others that we want to think about in this space.
Yeah, there's a new regulation that is coming out around if you are a contractor of or a subcontractor of the federal government, specifically with the Department of Defense. It's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. That would definitely, impact databases, as well as there's a federal acquisition regulation that's been drafted and will likely come into effect either later this year or next year, that would apply to all federal contractors and subcontractors, whether they're DoD or not. And, that's a huge, every federal agency, IRS, DHS, everybody would be impacted by those.
Great. And then Chris Shaw, from your experience, what are the biggest risks that you see in delaying that database modernization?
I think everybody has that drawer in their kitchen, right, where there's a little tool or a little screwdriver. You put together a desk and they gave you that little Allen wrench and you used it the one time. And then as soon as you were done with that, you threw it in the drawer and we're like, oh, we don't need that anymore, right? It's funny, that drawer isn't just for every household. It's also for RDBMSs. And I think every organization I've ever seen, they have a database that sits there in the corner somewhere. It doesn't have a lot of activity to it. It doesn't have a lot of, there's no problems, right? It just works. But nobody really knows. And over time, maybe the people who are responsible for it or the subject matter experts for that database have left the company, or they changed, or they got promoted, or they're working on something different. And now nobody knows who owns that data. Nobody knows how critical that is to the company. And then what happens is that the server goes offline on accident once because of the power, or it goes offline and everybody's up and screaming about it. So you get the database back online, and now everybody's looking at everybody else going, who's the expert in this? Who knows this data? And the problem is that those resources, that tribal knowledge is gone. And so when you start looking at how am I going to modernize, how am I going to bring this stuff into the future? The point I guess I'm trying to make here is that when these systems aren't getting any younger, if you have an old system now, and I've been in with organizations before, and I've talked to organizations in the past where their answer is, we don't know who owns this. We just know it's critical, and we know that there's nothing we can do about it. And that's really, really scary. Now we've worked in this situation before, and you have to get really in depth with this. You have to start running traces. You have to see where these applications are coming from. You need to see how the data is being used. You need to make sure it's backed up, knowing that you can restore it. There's a whole plethora of things that you need to be able to do before you go there, before you go into that modernization phase. But the biggest thing that I think that I would want for people to consider, or organizations to consider, is that by not addressing the risk that's there, doesn't mean the risk just goes away. Just because you haven't had a problem over the last 12 months doesn't mean that in the next 12 days you're not going to have a problem. And you shouldn't have systems that are sitting around waiting for that issue to pop up. How am I doing on time? I'm okay, I think.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I have a database that's in an organization. Now, it's not there currently. We're no longer working with this organization. But there was a database that we had at this organization at one point in time. Before they even became a client, they had corruption in that database that was introduced into a system table that was done in a version that's probably 4 different versions ago. All of the people that are experts in the data, how the data is managed, what the data is used for, they're all gone. All those resources were gone. But the problem is we couldn't get rid of the corruption. It was so deep inside some of the system tables that even resources at Microsoft were looking at this going, you know what? There's only one way out of this. You're going to have to create a new database, create a new shell, and you're going to have to take packages and remove all the data from the corrupted version and put it into the new version. That's a risk that if they don't deal with, there's going to be a day that something's going to happen and they're not going to be able to recover that data. They might not be able to get it from backups. I think there's a lot of risks here. And I don't think enough organizations are addressing these risks and saying, because it's easy, it's not a problem today, right? If it's not a problem today, then I don't have to fix it today. I can get to it next week. But eventually next week is going to come and it will be a problem.
And then Chris Silvers, to that point,
Mhm.
I think at least in the experience, and it kind of ties into what Chris Shaw was talking about, the experience that I've had with clients is there's this attitude that it hasn't happened to us, so it's not something we have to worry about. Is that something you see
Sure.
in terms of kind of security risks within SQL Server?
Sure.
Just
I mean, it's just it's the same risk, risk assessment methodology of, if it's not in front of me and it hasn't happened yet, then fingers crossed it probably won't, right? And, back in the day, 10, 20 years ago, I used to explain security kind of in those similar terms to say, it's like running from a bear in the woods, right? You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than at least one person who's running alongside you, right? And they'll get eaten and you'll be okay. Well, the problem with that analogy is that, because of the explosion of the internet and and just the proliferation of information and social media and all that, we're getting to the point where there are just as many bears as there are people, right? And so you truly do need to actually step up your game, because it's not a matter of if you're going to have a compromise, it's a matter of when. And SQL servers are considered the crown jewel of a business, right? That's where, I mean, it's the whole reason you stand up a SQL Server database to begin with, is to hold the most important information. And it's transactional and it's up to date and it's accurate and you've got all these performance features. Well, if I'm an attacker and I get a foothold into your environment, if I discover you have a database somewhere, I'm going to figure out how to get to that database, because especially these days with ransomware being so popular, that's the stuff I want to get a chokehold on, because that's going to allow me to disable your business if you don't pay the ransom, right?
yeah,
The fact that you can't get to some project plan or something like that, or some marketing slick, the business can go on. It's no big deal, right? But that data that runs the business, that's the important stuff.
yeah. Yeah, I remember being in a presentation about 15 years ago, and the presenter said that every business is a data business. And
Yeah.
it took me a while to get my head around that, but I mean, it's
Yeah.
very true. It's just, I
Yeah.
mean, I used to work for a very large insurance company, and you just think about that business. It's all about the data that they have, and
Yeah.
that is what drives that business. And as you
Yeah.
said, you wake up and you've got all your file system locked down. That is a scary thing.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And Frank, you were mentioning regulations, and one I was kind of listening for was PCI, the payment card industry. They're all about the data, right? It's all
mhm.
about the cardholder data, right?
Yeah,
And where is that data stored? In databases,
yeah.
right?
Yes, we do some work with people like that, so we're well
Yeah.
aware. All right. So, next question is just about kind of common roadblocks organizations are facing when modernizing their databases and things that they can do to overcome them. And I think, Chris Shaw, you talked a little bit about this in terms of ownership of databases, but can you speak a little bit more about just methods that you've seen that allow clients to overcome these roadblocks and these challenges?
Yeah. Oh, gosh, you have to, some of the methods that we've used to overcome those. Um, a lot of traces, a lot of X events. We go in and you have to pull out the regular maintenance routines. That's one of the big ones, is how do you determine if a workflow is a maintenance routine, if it's not a regular backup command versus, a reindexing, anytime data is accessed. Um, the biggest roadblock that we're seeing with this is being able to evaluate this data and separate what's valid and what's not valid. And frankly, it just takes a lot of time.
And when you talk about data being valid and not valid, are you talking about, are we talking about streamlining, or are we talking about analyzing that trace data to determine who owns things and what that looks
It,
like.
yeah, you know what? Sorry, I should have clarified a little bit more. I am talking about analyzing it, right? If you've got a database that's sitting on a platform and you go through and you're removing the fragmentation from the indexes, how do you know that that's not valid maintenance activity versus uh, somebody accessing that data record or that row inside the table isn't because they need to run a report on it, or that data is pulling old payment information from an old credit card bill or something along those lines. You have to be able to analyze and evaluate each of those workflows and be able to say, okay, this is old maintenance stuff. We don't need to worry about that. There's some things that you can do. You can go in and look at some of the query, some of the cache plans that are there, look at some of the old indexing statistics, see when the last time writes were done to the database. Um, Start removing logins. I mean, that's one of the methods that I will use when I'm going in and trying to track it down is I'll recognize, okay, this database may have 50 different users that have read and write access to it. Let's pull out the stuff that we know. I know that the account that's being run on the SQL Server agent service account may not necessarily be doing anything other than maintenance type activity. And it's just a matter of removing the stuff that you do know and then get left with the data that you don't know. And you're going to have to manually go through that and make that decision factor on, is this valid? Is this no longer valid? Is this needed? Where can we separate that?
Okay. And one other roadblock that I see a lot of times is, and I think Chris Shaw, you mentioned this earlier, is just the idea that you have vended applications, and those vended applications are generally certified for a specific version of SQL Server or up to a specific version. So 2016, 2019. So if you're looking to go to 2022, you may get pushback from the application that we're not certified on 2022, so we won't support you. What Microsoft will tell you in that scenario is that there's a setting within each database called compatibility level. So you can run a database on SQL Server 2022, but you can set the compatibility level back to 2019 or 2016. And effectively, that database will perform as if it were running on that previous version. And I think that I'm seeing, more and more buy-in from vendors, from application developers on this, but it still can be a little bit of a challenge. And Chris Silvers, did you have anything to speak to from a security perspective in terms of roadblocks that you've seen?
No, I think Chris Shaw really hit it, and really hit it on the head when he talked about expertise and tribal knowledge not being existent, right?
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to bring it forward and causing the having to run traces and having to sort of reverse engineer to figure out what is this database actually being used for, and what are the important pieces of it that we need to carry forward.
Great. So the next question, and I'll send this to Chris Shaw first. Can you share a real world example of a successful database modernization project, and what were your key takeaways from it?
We have spent a lot of time talking about the cloud, right? That's what it seems like. That's the magic keyword nowadays is everything's cloud. I say nowadays, it's been like that for the last 5, 6, 10 years. But there's a lot of modernizations that get done that are on-prem and that don't include the cloud. Take, for example, people that are running old school clusters and want to look at going to availability groups. There's, when you would run an old school cluster, one of the big problems with it is you were paying twice the amount of money so you could have twice the hardware resources. You had a really big, expensive shared SanDisk that was sitting in between those. And the problem is nobody was getting any use out of it. You had all this money invested into these old resources, and the only time you got to use it is when there was a problem and you failed over it. Maybe there was some maintenance benefits there that you could get, but really, one of the most successful modernizations that we've done is being able to take a organization that was on a cluster, put them inside of an availability group, because we didn't just modernize the databases, but we essentially were able to double their resources. We were able to take some of their write queries and make sure that those were focused on one node and do the read-only intent queries on the other node. You were able to offload some of the maintenance. We essentially were able to double the resources that were being assigned to the platform by simply bringing them up to date and getting them inside of an availability group. It was a pretty big success story, and I think that it makes them that much more scalable going into the future. I think it's important that when we look at modernization, it doesn't mean just the cloud. I think it means that there's a lot of feature sets all over all different kinds of platforms and operating systems that should be taken into consideration.
And one that I'll talk about, and it is cloud-based, and it relates to high availability, like Chris was talking about, clustering versus availability groups. I mentioned the managed offerings for SQL Server within Azure, and one of the benefits to those offerings is that there is high availability and disaster recovery built in. There are kind of two different tiers that you have there. The first one is general purpose, and there the high availability is driven by storage redundancy. So if you have a problem with a compute node that's running your SQL Server instance, it will actually spin up a new instance and just point at your data and log files. Business critical is the second tier, and that you're building out, when you build out a managed instance or an Azure SQL database in business critical, it's effectively building out an availability group underneath. So it's building out a Windows server failover cluster. It is building out the availability group so that in the event of an issue with a compute node, it's going to fail over. And general purpose versus business critical. Business critical is more expensive, but that AG infrastructure gives you faster failover. So that's something that I've seen clients take advantage of, being able to spin up this very complicated infrastructure with a couple of clicks or a PowerShell script, and then not having to worry about kind of care and feeding of that environment because Azure takes care of it. Chris Silvers, did you have anything to add in terms of real world examples that you've seen in terms of modernization?
No, I don't think so.
All right. And I think we've got one question left, and this is, I'm nervous about modernizing my database environment, either on-prem or in the cloud. What steps can you take to streamline that process? I'll throw that to Chris Shaw.
Testing. I can't stress it enough. How do you want to mitigate, these risks? Test, test, test. You can't plan enough for all the things that you'd never guess that's going to happen. Whether it be the failovers, whether it be, natural disasters. Who would ever guess that you'd have hurricanes that take out whole data centers, or some of these tragic events we've seen? I think that's the biggest point that I'd make with if you want to mitigate the risks, you need to test. You need to have a good rollback plan. Be able to go back to where you were. There's some places that once you do a in-place upgrade, or not, excuse me, not an in-place upgrade, but you do like a rolling upgrade. We'll do that often with availability groups. If we're going from one version to another, we'll just add the new version of the availability group failover. Problem is you can't fail back. Once you get there and you start putting data into it, you can't go back to the older version. And that's where the testing is going to help. Put forward the effort at the beginning, put forward the time and the resources to make sure that things are appropriately tested. It's your company's data. It's probably the most valuable resource that you have outside the people. And you have to appropriately test it all.
Yeah, and another thing I'd bring up there is, you definitely want to test that application on the new version to make sure you're not going to run into any issues. But I'll jump to the cloud one more time. And one of the challenges with the cloud is that you have an on-prem environment that you're migrating from. You have run in that environment. You know that your application will run successfully with the resources that you have provisioned. The challenge can be figuring out how that workload maps to resources in the cloud. And you need to do that effectively. One of the things that you need to do is, baseline the existing environment for performance. Figure out when your application is running at peak load, how hard are you pushing the resources you have, and may have a potential to reduce the number of resources that are allocated. I know that that can be scary, the idea of removing hardware or removing horsepower, but if you're not using those resources, you're paying for something that just you're not using. So being able to run perfmon to grab a baseline, or if you have any sort of a vetted monitoring tool, being able to pull that performance baseline and see what that baseline looks like. And then also just having a handle on the inventory in your current environment in terms of resources, processor count, processor type, processor speed, your memory size, how much storage are you using, and networking. And there are cost estimators for all the cloud platforms. I'm most familiar with the Azure cost estimator, but you can estimate cost, and it can give you an idea of, if I stand up these machines with this much horsepower and these features, this is what the estimated cost is going to be. And that can really prevent sticker shock going forward. So I believe that was the last of the questions. Andrea, did anything come through in the chat or the Q&A?
We do not have any questions.
Is there anything, Chris Silvers or Chris Shaw, you'd like to add just in terms of the overarching topic of modernization?
Well, actually, I get asked a lot as far as like balancing, user convenience and security controls, right? And being in the information security space for as long as I have, back in the late '90s, we used to joke that we were the Department of No, right? You know, business unit would come and say, we've got this great idea, we're going to make all this money, everybody's going to be happy dancing in the streets, and we would say, no, it sounds too risky, right? And and using some of the kind of the legacy, we should have belts and suspenders, and an ironclad truss or something around our waist, but where it is possible to over secure something, right? And back in 2017, I was exposed to something that really kind of opened my eyes to this subject, and it's a document that came out. It was a special publication that came out from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST. And I would highly recommend anyone who's in charge of security or having to implement security, especially for databases and especially when you're dealing with user access, read this document. It's NIST Special Publication 863. Now, revision 3 is the one that really opened my eyes. I think the current revision that's in draft form is revision 4, but I can't imagine that they've strayed much from this. But to give you an example, one of the recommendations was to not force users to change their passwords every 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, or whatever, right? They basically did studies and found that the psychology behind forcing someone to change their password, it actually weakens the password. And in most cases, when they change their password from the old password, there will be a pattern to their passwords, and you could probably figure out their new password anyway, right? I was doing a penetration test one time, and I cracked somebody's password, and it was April 24. right? And when I went to use the password, it didn't work because they had changed their password. Well, it happened to be the end of the month. Yeah. And so, of course, the first guess that I made, May 24, it worked, right? Because it was logical. So and I use that to illustrate the point of we can sometimes in security be a little overzealous in thinking that we're securing something more when we're really just making it less convenient for the users and it's not really adding to security. So it's really important to kind of focus on what are those controls that are really going to make the difference and hopefully minimize the burden on the users.
And that was NIST special publication 800-63.
63, yes.
Okay. All right.
That's my favorite.
All right.
I
Trish.
love that comment because it's really close to the one comment that I would make, which is, a lot of the biggest reason that companies need to modernize the data is because they kept being told that you can't do this, or you can't do it for this reason, or you can't do it for that reason. Oh, we don't know what the impact's going to be here, or the risk is too much this way. And I think you really need to start looking, organizations need to start looking at this with the attitude of, don't tell us how we can't do something.
Yeah.
Let me show you how I can do it.
Yeah.
Let me show you how we can get this into the most recent platform and make it work better for you.
Yeah, this is 2025. We all have to be enablers of the business, no matter what our role is. We have to consider ourselves enablers instead of trying to hold the business back.
I'm going to use that the next time I go to the ice cream store with my wife. We need
There
to
you
be
go.
enablers. Sorry,
Yes.
I digress.
I want to know how I can get that sherbet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Frank, for hosting. I appreciate
No
it.
problem.
Yeah.
Chris Silvers, I was just going to joke that your comment about the Department of No, at an old job, we had the cab meeting every Friday, and there was a gentleman who we affectionately referred to as Dr. No. It's like, no matter what it was, it's on a rack next to mine. Nope, you can't make the change.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, a friend of mine used to say that the tagline for their security department was, "If we're doing our jobs, you can't do yours."
that seems suboptimal.
I feel like we've got some good slogans for some t-shirts or coffee mugs, perhaps.
There you go. There you go.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for participating. Yeah. Andrea, is there anything you want to close with?
If anybody has any questions, please reach out. Our contact information's available, and we will be following up with the recording as well. So appreciate everybody and hope to see you at our next one.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. And by the way, speaking of contact information, I went ahead and put this in the chat channel. It was my website and my LinkedIn profile if anybody would like to get in touch.
All right.
Thank you much.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Have a good day.
All righty. Thanks, folks. Take care.